0550 hours, 7th of May, 1978. A bit early in the morning for respectable people to be out and about in central London. And on a Sunday, too. But these members of the Royal Air Force are canoeing down the Thames as part of their training for one of the most ambitious kayak journeys ever proposed. Their goal is to break the world record of 56 days for paddling down the entire 2,300 miles of the Mississippi River. The whole exercise started with Flight Lieutenant Brian Smith, an instructor at the Area Radar Training Squadron at RAF Shawbury. He was looking for a suitable project for the RAF Canoe Association to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of the founding of the Royal Air Force. The old record for canoeing the Mississippi had been set by Professor Gerald Capers in 1937. It would be interesting to see how the techniques and equipment evolved during the intervening 40 years would stand up to the mighty American river. Before mounting an expedition of this nature, many hours had to be spent researching into the feasibility of the project, seeking approval and obtaining the necessary equipment and finance. The administrative burden was shared by Brian Young, who would become the expedition cameraman and support crew leader. Every detail, no matter how small, had to be settled before the expedition could leave for the United States. The design of a suitable logo was particularly important, as it would be in the public eye throughout the 2.5-month trip. Important and time-consuming as the paperwork was, it couldn't be allowed to overshadow the main task in hand, the selection and training of 6 men for the demanding journey down the longest river in America. What better place for the final rehearsal than the longest and most picturesque river in Britain, the Severn? Even during the preliminary training, the team had to be prepared to stop for interviews. The media are always quick to catch on to projects involving human endurance, and Brian Smith soon got used to explaining the aims and hopes of the expedition. Public relations were to become an important part of the trip, and the local radio and television interviews were just a foretaste of what was to come in America. The paddlers were supported by a backup crew of 4, who had to familiarize themselves with the advanced radio equipment that would play a vital part in communications on the Mississippi. Even after a long, hot 40 miles, one crew still found the energy for a little fun at the weir in Shrewsbury. This journey down the Severn took 3 days. If the Mississippi record was to be broken, the canoeists would have to maintain this rate of progress for up to 55 days. Like the Severn, the Mississippi would be mainly flat and wide, though the navigation charts did show several rapids on the upper reaches. Passing the world's first iron bridge at Telford, built in 1779, signaled the start of 2 miles of fast water. The 2-seat racing kayaks were designed for speed on flat water, but these rapids provided good practice for possible rough water to come. A number of runs were attempted, and going back up against the current was always a little harder than coming down. If this is an omen of problems to come, perhaps a little more practice wouldn't come amiss. With the training over, it was time for the expedition equipment to be sent from the various units to RAF Lynham to await departure. (11:30 hours, 12th of August, 1978. Final preparations complete. The party leave RAF Lynham on a regular Hercules flight to the USA. Shortly before landing, the expedition catches its first glimpse of the mighty Mississippi, and even from 24,000 feet through the haze, it looks pretty impressive. Touchdown is at Offutt Air Force Base near Omaha, Nebraska, which is 600 miles south of the source of the Mississippi, Lake Itasca, in northern Minnesota. The next 4 days will be spent preparing equipment and buying 2 vehicles that it's hoped will last the 8,000-mile road journey ahead. Instead of making straight for Lake Itasca, a diversion is made to Chicago, Illinois, to take up an invitation to participate in the United States Canoe Association's National Marathon Championships. This flag-waving exercise promises to be both enjoyable and useful. The expedition's fast-racing kayaks are ideally suited to this 17-mile race. Brian Smith and Peter Dodd beat the nearest American canoe by more than 3 minutes. In spite of the marvelous hospitality shown to the expedition throughout the championships, an invitation to stay longer has to be refused. The road to Lake Itasca calls. The route to northern Minnesota lies through Minneapolis, which the expedition will paddle through on their way back down the river. The actual source of the Mississippi was established only as recently as 1832 by Henry Schoolcraft. The commemorative log overstates the river's mileage by 200 miles, to the relief of the motley crew posing for photographs to please the many tourists gathered at the source lake. Stepping stones mark the boundary between the lake and the river proper. The serious business has begun. From now on, all time wasted will count against the record. But it is still necessary to go round Lake Itasca before tackling the tiny stream that will eventually drain 80% of the landlocked United States. The first of many Mississippi bridges that are going to be passed on the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And certainly not the last of the hellos and goodbyes that are going to be said to new friends along the way. Mechanical breakdowns became another regular feature of the expedition, this one occurring on the journey back to the river from the first night's campsite. Fortunately, once underway, the paddlers don't get delayed by these MT problems. The state of Minnesota is known as the land of 25,000 lakes. Within the first 150 miles, several have to be crossed. Some are relatively small, only a mile or so across. But the third day's paddling brings a series of mainly large lakes, linked by a slow-moving Mississippi. Even during this early stage of the journey, the visit to the national championships begins to pay off. A fellow competitor at Chicago, Jim Fleming, provides an escort across the largest lake of all, the oddly named Winnigibboshish, known locally as Big Winnie. At 13 miles from shore to shore, it's quite a challenge, almost like being on the open sea. More old friends from Chicago, the Rudquists, follow the support crew during the next day, not only cheering the paddlers on, but also providing truly magnificent meals. After the first few days, news of the mad Englishman has spread to the main cities in the state, and television crews drop by to catch an interview with this out-of-the-ordinary expedition. Some interviewers seem to be more popular than others. One of the more unexpected problems encountered on this beautiful but heavily wooded part of the river is simply not being able to see the waiting support crew. Among the trees, even the near-naked Peter Ball can easily be missed. Compensation comes in an increase in river speed, after one of the wettest summers for years. Before they know it, the paddlers have arrived at the night's campsite, already set up by the industrious support crew. After a quick evening meal, time for relaxation or planning the next day's task. While some have work to do, others can think about more leisurely pursuits, or just contemplate arrival at the largest metropolis on the Mississippi. Once the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul are reached, the river changes dramatically and is now fully navigable for the rest of its 1,800-mile course. Communication between paddlers and support crew becomes much easier. For the next 33 days, the paddlers are going to be escorted by the expedition's Gemini inflatable support boat, which carries 2 crew members, together with rations, first aid equipment, and an HF radio to keep in touch with the 2 land vehicles. The Gemini's main role will be that of a rescue boat. Although the placid surface of Lake Pepin shows no sign of being troublesome, the presence of pleasure craft is a hint of hazards to come. The local boat owners are all extremely friendly, but also hell-bent on going as fast as possible. They seem totally unaware of the problems their wash can cause to the frail racing craft. Luckily, the perils of this pleasure traffic last only the 3 days of the Labor Day holiday weekend. Between La Crosse, Wisconsin and Dubuque, Iowa, one brave young reporter decides to risk all by trying one of the kayaks. Unfortunately, Steve Stevenson manages to keep the boat upright and the young lady dry. Dubuque, day 16. Although still averaging nearly 50 miles a day on the near stationary water, the first hour's paddling is hell. Muscle pain is severe. The diet proves to contain too little protein to rebuild the used muscle tissues. Immediately, the intake is increased and the daily mileage reduced to 45 miles to enable the body to assimilate the extra protein. The Mississippi Valley has been flooded for purposes of navigation and rather resembles the Amazon jungle. The paddlers have to penetrate half a mile of this wilderness to reach a suitable campsite. Not all the stops were so remote, however. A special treat was in store when the expedition reached Quincy, Illinois. A civic welcome at the quayside and the by now routine interviews with the local television station. And finally, a night spent as guests of the Ramada Inn and the city's Chamber of Commerce. Normally, the crews try not to stop for more than 15 minutes at a time during the day's paddling because of the muscles stiffening up. But the next port of call is Hannibal, Missouri, boyhood home of Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. It's impossible to refuse the hospitality of the citizens, who present Brian Smith with the keys of the city and introduce Tom Sawyer and Becky in the persons of two youngsters who've won this year's competition to represent Mark Twain's famous characters. The whole party is taken on a trip to see the sights of this famous river town. In fact, the people of Hannibal really take the expedition to their hearts. Reluctantly, the show has to go on. One of the drawbacks of this sort of record attempt. Moreover, the wind increases on a particularly wide stretch of the river, and the choppy water soon begins to fill the kayaks. Pete and Brian make a gallant dash for the bank, but are not destined to reach it before they sink. It's the sort of occurrence only to be expected in these conditions, but there's no danger with the Gemini and her crew standing by for the rescue. The last of the 30 or so locks signals yet another dramatic change in river conditions, as by now the Mississippi has been joined by the Missouri. But the effect won't be felt until after leaving the Chain of Rocks lock. The river is now quite rough, and the increase in current soon speeds the party into St. Louis, Missouri, to a night spent under the tallest monument in the United States. It was from here that the Lewis and Clark expedition set out in May 1804 to discover a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Hence, the 630-foot Memorial Arch, the gateway to the West. Following a calm night, the morning's paddling is lost because of an amazing storm which deposits 6 inches of rain on St. Louis in as many hours. But by the afternoon, the storm is over, and the expedition prepares to set off once again. As Mac, still stiff even after a morning's rest from paddling, eases himself into the rear seat of the 23-foot kayak, the storm has made the crews aware of the danger of water getting into the canoes. So Terry makes doubly sure that his spray deck is fully fastened. From now on, the spray decks are in regular use, particularly fortunate as the calm water near the city centre leads on to the roughest water of the expedition. Despite a 5-knot current, it takes 2 hours to cover the 13 miles to the first point where paddling can be abandoned for the day. The Gemini and its crew are responsible for a number of rescues, and Dick and Ian certainly earn their keep on this particular day. Now that the river is no longer restricted by locks and dams, the size of the barge tows increases alarmingly. Some of the river traffic, though, is much more attractive. The Delta Queen is the oldest steam paddle wheeler operating on the Mississippi. The southerly winds continue to blow hard, and the Gemini is given plenty of opportunities to perfect its rescue techniques. After reaching a capsized kayak, the Gemini crew can now empty the boat, retrieve the paddlers, and send them on their way in less than 3 minutes. Memphis, Tennessee, day 32, and 1,580 miles from Lake Itasca. A superb opportunity to witness the skill of the barge captains as they maneuver their tows into the river from the narrow harbour mouth. Hourly radio checks between the Gemini and the cars keep the land support crew in touch with the paddlers' progress throughout each day. Navigation on the Mississippi is the responsibility of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Their distance to run markers are invaluable in accurately locating the water party's position. The main task of the Corps, however, is not the marking of the navigation channel, but bank protection. Every year, many thousands of tons of rock and thousands of yards of special concrete matting are used in an effort to contain the wild river, work which dates back to the first use of levees by the French of New Orleans in 1718. After 9 hours paddling, the evening brings a welcome rest. But the beauty of early morning departures is appreciated by canoeists and Gemini crew alike. Whatever the time of day, it was always necessary to keep a sharp lookout. Not for the alligators they've yet to see, but for the massive barges whose jaws would surely be as fatal. One of the results of the Mississippi's early meanderings is to make access to the river difficult for the land support crew, on occasion leaving the water party stranded for the night, miles from the nearest road. Camp life goes on, of course, but instead of steaks on the menu, it's tiny portions of curry from the aircrew emergency rations. These are carried at all times on board the kayaks, along with water and purification tablets. Learning quickly from this experience, the Gemini subsequently carries a good supply of camping equipment and proper food. Day 37 sees the expedition less than 400 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. At Natchez, Mississippi, they meet the mighty Mississippi Queen. The captain, somewhat unsportingly, refuses Brian Young's generous offer of a seat in the Gemini in exchange for his cabin on board that massive holiday boat. Ever since leaving Cairo, Illinois, the expedition has been encountering evidence of the continuing battle by the Corps of Engineers against river erosion. Approaching Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the paddlers become aware of yet another change in river conditions and traffic. The Mississippi is now slower and never less than half a mile wide. In fact, its width often reaches a mile, and although still 250 miles from the Gulf, seagoing ships regularly visit this part of the river. Crude oil is one of the main imports, and numerous refineries can be seen lining the banks. Despite increasing industrialization, wildlife flourishes. These egrets are quite used to the passage of large barges, but soon take flight as the paddlers approach. The paddling routine continues to be 1 hour's work followed by 10 minutes break. With temperatures in the upper 80s and often higher, the gallon of squash drunk by each man daily is essential to ward off dehydration. In the 3 days since passing the Mississippi Queen at Natchez, she's gone on downriver to New Orleans and returned with another eager crowd of modern-day gamblers. The cost of a fortnight's cruise for a family would more than cover the total expenses of the 2.5 months of Mississippi Paddle 78. Less attractive, but more vital to the economy of the nation, colliers transfer vast quantities of coal into barges, which in their turn will keep the industries of the north supplied with this vital fuel. The pollution level in the river remains remarkably low. 2,000 miles downstream and children still play on the banks. On most nights, the crew members use the water to wash away the grit of the day's travelling. The 2nd of October is the day the old record is to fall. With nearly 70 miles to paddle to New Orleans, and with a decrease in river flow, it's necessary to start even earlier than usual. At 0600, the paddlers are not at their most sociable, but this particular morning is brightened by a spontaneous gift of rations from a passing tug, a gesture typical of the generosity and kindness shown to the expedition by the American public. Approaching New Orleans. Concern for the safety of the paddlers prompts the U.S. Coast Guard to offer to escort the expedition through one of the busiest harbors in the world. At first, however, the Coast Guard launch causes problems of its own by creating an unnerving wash. Up to now, the racing kayaks have been extremely reliable, and any problems have been minor, with no effect on the expedition's progress. How ironic, then, that today of all days, Steve Stevenson's kayak has to lose its rudder fin. With little or no control over direction, Steve soldiers on until a replacement rudder can be found and brought out to meet him. Ever conscious of the value of good public relations, the Coast Guard quickly responds by sending out another boat, carrying not only a spare rudder, but also a gaggle of reporters. When the rudder has been fixed and Brian Smith dragged away from the reporters, the paddlers are underway again for the final miserable miles into New Orleans. It was to this point in 1937 that Professor Gerald Capers and 2 companions paddled their canoe Tonawanda to establish a new world record of 56 days from Lake Itasca. Many have tried since then, but it falls to our band of Royal Air Force adventurers to smash this record by reaching New Orleans in under 41 days. But this is not the end of the line. The ultimate goal is the Gulf of Mexico, and that's still 90 miles away. Any departure from the Crescent City is sad, but rarely can there have been more reluctant voyagers than these 6 paddlers. Eventually, the miles on the distance to run markers slip into single figures, and another Coast Guard cutter arrives to see the deed done. This boat will also serve as a means of transport back to civilization from the head of passes, the point where the Mississippi officially meets the sea. That point is reached at 15:25 hours on the 4th of October 1978. The expedition has paddled 2,320 miles in a new record time of 42 days, 4 hours and 59 minutes. Only when safely aboard the Coast Guard cutter can they accept the fact that it's really over. For some, there'll be no more paddling. For others, though, there are already thoughts of the next challenge.